Welcome back. It's Nicole Naditz, and today we are talking about empowering students to use the target language. Like before, this is based on both an infographic and an overview article that you can find in your resources in Canvas. And today's article is also written by Alyssa Villarreal. And what we're going to be looking at really is if we're trying to do that 90% target language use, we have to remember that it's not just the teacher. It also applies to students. So what are some strategies we can put in place to make it possible for our learners to also use the target language at least 90% of the time? And in order to do that, we really have to understand a few things that we're going to be talking about throughout the course of today's lesson. We have to understand the input to output continuum. And when students resort to English, teachers want to consider some questions that might help them understand why the students are resorting to English. For example, have I created a safe learning environment where students are willing to take risks? Or did I provide sufficient input before asking them to produce output? And do I provide supports that encourage students to stretch their application of learning and use the target language? And we will talk about these questions one at a time. So one of the first things we want to do is to look at the growth mindset and its importance and role in fostering target language use. Because a lot of our students are really hitting us when they are at a very vulnerable age. They don't want to be seen making mistakes in front of their peers, and yet we need them to make mistakes in order to grow. So knowing that fitting in is often awkward or difficult for students, we really have to consciously create a safe and supportive learning environment in our classes if our students are going to be successful language learners and users. And one way to do this is to embrace a growth mindset and then foster that in our learners. And what this means is that the most basic abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work. Brains and talent might be a starting point, but if you're willing to keep trying and keep learning and learn from the mistakes and setbacks you have, you really can learn to do almost anything. So fostering students on growth, focusing students on growth and building a collaborative environment that celebrates creativity and risk-taking is actually a first step in helping students stay in the target language. And we're actually going to come back to that collaborative piece as well in a moment. But basically the goal is to help students always see their ultimate goal as just trying to be a better person today than they were yesterday. Be stronger at a skill today than they were yesterday. They're not trying to jump from not being able to do it at all to being perfect. They're just trying to show growth. So as we look at this growth mindset, we want to ensure that our students see failure as an opportunity to learn rather than as a permanent setback. One of the ways we can do that is actually to value feedback over grades. We don't need to give a grade on everything students do because not everything they do is ready to be evaluated. Often all students need is feedback that they can use to get better. Another aspect about a growth mindset is that we should require collaboration in our classes. First of all, that just makes sense because we are in a language class, and if we're in a proficiency-oriented language classroom, collaboration is a natural extension of the growth mindset because it takes at least two people to communicate. And when communication happens, feedback takes center stage. So we'll have these common goals. We might even use grading rubrics, but we're going to work towards them together. And everything we do together will be focused on achieving those same targets and meeting the same criteria. Another thing we want to look at, as I mentioned earlier, is whether or not we provide sufficient input before we require output. Because if we jump too quickly to the output phase, our students will feel required to slip back into English because they simply don't have the skills yet to produce that quantity of target language. So we really want to look at the use of total participation techniques. Actually, let me go back here. We're going to look at the use of TPT, or total participation techniques, because that will actually help all of our learners safely participate, because it allows them all to engage in the input process at the same time, get data on how they're doing, and then prepare for output. We heard about some of these total participation techniques in the video we did in the last module, where we talked about using whiteboards, or having all the students line up based on a question, or having all the students hold up a picture or a card, or having students use their phones or an iPad or a Chromebook to provide responses. These strategies really are critical at the early stages of new learning in language in order for students to feel like they can move to output and start producing language. So another thing that we're going to want to look at is the students' understanding of proficiency and performance, because we don't want to keep our goals a secret from our learners. So it's more efficient if the students actually understand performance and proficiency as the academic language of learning a new language. We want to share with them what we mean when we say novice low, novice mid, novice high, intermediate low, and so on. We want to share with them what the learning targets are. So if our goal is to focus on developing proficient users of a language, we have to share that learning progression with them. It helps them understand where they are and where they are trying to go, and what it will look like when they get there. And in order to facilitate their understanding of proficiency and performance, we want to make sure that we have clear expectations for each performance level. So if you're targeting intermediate range production from your learners, you don't want to have a prompt that is a list type response, because listing is a novice skill. So we want to make sure we are clear in our expectations. We also want to provide descriptive feedback. This descriptive feedback is really important, because when we do so, we give learners multiple opportunities to re-tackle the same concept, to demonstrate growth, to recycle and bring in old material. We also find that rubrics are very helpful here, because sometimes we can do all that description ahead of time in the rubric, and that makes it more efficient for us to provide that descriptive feedback that helps learners understand where they are now, where they need to go, and exactly what it looks like when they get there. That's what a well-written rubric will do for us, and we'll be talking about rubrics later in this course. We also want to do opportunities that facilitate peer and self-assessment using the same rubric that the teacher will use. This helps clarify expectations. We want to support the development of critical thinking skills, including by using student reflection tasks, where the students make the connections between what they already know and what they are now learning. And finally, we want to make sure we focus on what is most important. For example, the current level of performance tells us all what is needed for the next level. At early stages of proficiency, we want to focus on comprehension, but we're going to focus on accuracy at the higher ranges of proficiency. So we're going to move into some strategies now that help our learners integrate functional chunks and transition words so that they have language to use to stay in the target language. One of those favorite strategies is passwords, because by doing it's not the game password, but it's really useful phrases that the students just learn as a memorized chunk, and they don't understand the grammar or why it works. They just know that that's the chunk they need. For example, how to ask for meaning or clarify, how to ask for permission, how to ask what page we're on, how to ask if they need to work with a partner. Well, in the classroom setting, all of those would be really useful to them. They'll need to use them more than once, so it would be worthwhile to teach them how to do that in the target language so that they can stay in the language. Another strategy that some teachers like to use is a language ladder. Now, this is for slightly more proficient users who are ready to explore different ways of expressing the same idea. So memorized chunks of language are grouped together to show different ways of saying the same thing. For example, there's more than one way to say hello. So they don't always have to use the same memorized chunk all the time, because that wouldn't be natural. That's not how we use language. We use a variety of expressions to get at the same idea. Various greetings, various exclamations, various questions. They can all be grouped, usually vertically, so that they go from perhaps easiest or closest to their home language to a little more complicated or a little more nuanced. Another way to give students some language they can use to stay in the language is to have sentence frames that help students use key vocabulary while providing a structure that might be higher than what they could normally produce. The sentence frame or stem gives them what they need, and all they have to plug in are the missing words. For example, you provide on the wall sentence frames like I like, I want, I need. They don't have to understand the grammar. All they need to be able to do is fill in the rest of the sentence when they want to talk to you. Transition and linking words help them put their ideas together in a way that sounds more natural. So you might want to provide those transition words somewhere where the class can see them. And, or, but, however, are great words to provide your learners. Graphic organizers can be a great way to ensure that our learners can organize and chunk material. When we organize material on paper, that actually helps the brain learn it. So you might want to use graphic organizers in the target language so that it's easier for them to pick the language they want to use in a given situation in order to stay in the language. A word wall provides an extensive amount of vocabulary that builds over time, over the course of the year, so that students remember that they can keep coming back to the things we've learned and practiced and use them whenever they need them. Similarly, some teachers like to do a grammar wall using some of the key grammatical concepts that students are going to need to keep referring to and using in order to stay in the language. So I hope that this helps us all be thoughtful about not just our target language use, but our students' target language use and how to foster that. Thank you so much for joining us.